This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We spend today's hour looking at the bloody struggle to obtain and protect voting rights in this country. Since 2010, at least 10 states have passed laws that require people to show a government-issued photo ID when they go to the polls. While supporters say the laws protect against voter fraud, others argue they're more likely to suppress voter turnout among people of color, the poor, and the elderly, who may lack the proper ID and find it harder to obtain one. In total, 16 states have passed restrictive voting laws that could shape the 2012 election, including the vital swing states of Florida and Pennsylvania. Well, on Monday, NAACP President Ben Jealous made voting rights the center of his address to the group's annual convention in Houston.
Right now, in this moment, with 120 days left until the election, we have a choice to make. We can allow this election, Jerry Monzar, to be stolen in advance, as a politician from Pennsylvania recently bragged about when he thought no one was listening, talking about his state's voter ID law. Or we can double down on democracy and overcome the rising tide of voter suppression with a higher tide of voter registration and mobilization and activation and protection.
Well, today we're joined by a leader of the civil rights movement who risked his life numerous times marching for the right of all Americans to vote. 13-term Democratic Congressmember John Lewis of Georgia. He was a leader of the civil rights movement who marched side by side with Dr. Martin Luther King. He served as chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, helped organize the Freedom Rides, and spoke at the 1963 March on Washington. He's been arrested more than 40 times and has just written a new book called Across That Bridge: Life Lessons and a Vision for Change. He visited us in our studio, and I asked Congressmember Lewis about the voter purge in Florida, where the Justice Department had sued to block Republican Governor Rick Scott's controversial effort to remove thousands of registered voters from the rolls using an outdated driver's license database to ostensibly identify non-citizens registered to vote.
It is unreal, it is unbelievable that at this time in our history, 47 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed and signed into law, that we're trying to go backward. I think there is a systematic, deliberate attempt on the part of so many of these states, not just Florida, but it's all across the country. It's not just southern states, to keep people from participating. I think there is an attempt to steal this election before it even takes place, to make it hard, to make it difficult for our seniors, for our students, for minorities, for the disabled to participate in the democratic process. It's not right, it's not fair, and it's not just.
Why do these voter purges actually target the groups you've just talked about? How do they target them? Maybe you can explain what you were so pivotal in having passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Well, I think this make-believe that we do not purge, or we do not weed out some of these people, they're going to come out and vote, and they're going to vote not the way that some people would like for them to vote. They are primarily Democratic voters. It makes me want to just cry after people gave a little blood, after some people were beaten, shot, and murdered, trying to help people become registered voters. I can never forget the 3 civil rights workers that were murdered in the state of Mississippi on the night of June 21st, 1964. Other people shot down in cold blood. The march from Selma to Montgomery, where 17 of us were seriously injured. And we passed the Voting Rights Act, we renewed the act, we extend the act, and then the state of Florida, the state of Georgia, Alabama, and other states throughout the nation come along with tactics to make it hard, to make it difficult for people to participate. We shouldn't be making it easy and simple and open up the political process and let all of the people come in.
Explain what the Voting Rights Act said.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 said, in effect, that you cannot use the literacy test, you cannot have a poll tax, you cannot use certain devices, you cannot harass, you cannot intimidate. And before you make any changes in election laws dealing with registration, changing a precinct, local lines for any political position, you have to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice or the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. So the state of Florida, for example, never sought to get clearance to purge, and they hide behind that may be fraud, that's their own.
You were on that Selma to Montgomery march. You had your head bashed in for this. Can you explain what happened as we go back, almost half a century now?
On March 7, 1965, a group of us attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to dramatize to the nation that people wanted to register to vote. One young African-American man had been shot and killed a few days earlier in an adjoining county called Perry County. This is in the Black Belt of Alabama, the home county of Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., the home county of Mrs. Ralph Abernathy, the home county of Mrs. Andrew Young. And because of what happened to him, we made a decision to march. In Selma, Alabama in 1965, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. The only place you could attempt to register was to go down to the courthouse. You had to pass a so-called literacy test. And they were told people over and over again that they didn't or couldn't pass the literacy test. On one occasion, a man was asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. On another occasion, a man was asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. There were African-American lawyers, doctors, teachers, housewives, college professors flunking the so-called literacy test. And we had to change that. So we sought to march. And we got to the top of the bridge. We saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. And we continued to walk. We came within hearing distance of the state troopers. And a man identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march and will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And one of the young people walking with me, leading the march, a man by the name of Jose Williams, who was on the staff of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troopers, advance." And you saw these guys putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, trampling us with horses. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. My legs went out from under me. I felt like I was going to die. I thought I saw death. All these many years later, I don't recall how I made it back across that bridge to the church. But as I got back to the church is full to capacity. More than 2,000 people outside trying to get in to protest what had happened on the bridge. And someone asked me to say something to the audience. And I stood up and said something like, "I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote." The next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to a local hospital in Selma.
Explain that moment where you decided to move forward, because I don't think the history we learn records those small acts that are actually gargantuan acts of bravery. Talk about, I mean, you saw the weapons the police arrayed against you. What propelled you forward, Congressmember Lewis?
Well, my mother, my father, my grandparents, my uncles and aunts, and people all around me had never registered to vote. I've been working all across the South The state of Mississippi had a black voting age population of more than 450,000, and only about 16,000 were registered to vote. On that day, we didn't have a choice. I think we have been tracked down by what I call the spirit of history, and we couldn't turn back. We had to go forward. We became like trees planted by the rivers of water. We were anchored, and I thought we would die. I first thought we would be arrested and go to jail, but I thought it was a real possibility that some of us would down that bridge that day after the confrontation occurred. I thought it was the last protest for me, but somehow, in some way, you have to keep going. You go to a hospital, you go to a doctor's office, you get mended, and you get up and try it again.
So what was the next act you engaged in?
Well, we continued to organize, continued to try to get people registered. We went to federal court and testified to get an injunction against Governor George Wallace and Alabama state troopers. And the federal court said that we had a right to mourn from Selma to Montgomery. President Johnson spoke to the nation and condemned the violence in Selma, introduced the Voting Rights Act, and that night he made one of the most meaningful speeches than any American president had made in modern time on the whole question of civil rights and voting rights. He condemned the violence over and over again. And near the end of the speech, he said, "And we shall overcome. We shall overcome." We call it the "We Shall Overcome" speech. I was sitting next to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as we listened to President Johnson. I looked at Dr. King. Tears came down his face. He started crying. And we all cried a little when we heard the president saying, "We shall overcome." And Dr. King said, "We will make it from Selma to Montgomery, and the Voting Rights Act will be passed." 2 weeks later, more than 10,000 of us, people from all over America, started walking from Selma to Montgomery. And by the time we made it to Montgomery 5 days later, there were almost 30,000 black and white citizens, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, men, women, young people. It was like a holy march. And the Congress debated the act, passed it, and on August 6, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed it into law.
Congressmember John Lewis. We continue our conversation after break.